Welcome back. In this session, we want to improve on the model that we have started to build out. And specifically, just in terms of a reminder, we have created a vehicle class and we have pre-configured it with data values. In other words, we have hard-coded the data values. In order to make this usably in terms of a real-world context, we need to now find a way to improve on the model by ensuring that the user is able to enter the length and the width, enter these details for the property. So we're now going to work on making the adjustments so that this can happen. So we are back in C++, and what we now need to do is to create an operation, a method that will take the data values in as parameters and store them inside the vehicle object so that we can then display. We're going to therefore create another method. It won't return anything, so it's going to be void. Let's call it store details. And in this case, we now need two parameters to represent the data that is being entered into the system. Namely, we need a parameter for length and we need a parameter for width. They're going to be integer values because the length and the width, which are the properties, are actually integer values. So we need to be consistent. We now need our begin and our end so that we can now define the body of the method. And the body of the method is going to be simple. We need to assign what is in L to length. And we need to assign what is in W to width. So we now have length is assigned L. And then we have width is assigned W. And by setting up our method in this way, where the parameters are entered, we can now go to the main program and make adjustments so that we change the data values for length and width. And that is done easily by creating the object first of all. And then having created the object, we're now going to make use of the store details operation. So it's going to be v.store details, which is the operation that we want to make use of. And this time we're now going to place the data values that we want to place into the class. So for example, we want to store 21 for length, and we want to store 52 for the width. So we store, we put on the semicolon, and then we are now going to execute to see the output. So we execute, and we are seeing here where it says that the length is 21 and the width is 50, which means that we have successfully created an operation that we can use in the main program, actually update the property values for the vehicle class. Let's now do something similar in terms of Python. So let's go over to the Python code. Once again, we have our properties, length and width, that were pre-configured with the values 5 and 10 respectively. And we now want to set this up so that in a similar manner to what we did in C++, so that we can initialize the properties with the data values that we choose. So what we're going to do, we're going to make use of the init method, and we are going to add additional parameters. Let's call it L and W, so that we are consistent with what we did over in C++. And what now obtains is that we can put in a value for L, and we can put in a value for W, and we can use those to update the properties of the class. So instead of having 5 here, we're now going to assign L to length property. And we're also going to assign W to the length property. In order to see this in operation in a similar manner as to what we did on line 30 when we used the store details operations, the equivalent in Python is to go to the init command. So remember, whenever we use the vehicle command here on line 15, it is the same thing as if we are making use of the init command. And the init command is what we use to update the property values. So we put 21 here for the length or for L. And we put 52 here for the width. And then we now execute. And once again, we are seeing that in the Python space, we have updated the length to 21, and we have updated the width to 52, similar to what we actually did in terms of C++. So this is step one in the process. We have now set up the operations that we need to use in the main program so that we can update the properties of the vehicle class. Step two in the process now involves us actually getting some data values from the user and passing those data values into the class itself. And that makes the solution more real-world oriented. So I'm going to go to the main program. We want it to be interactive. So we are going to prompt the user to enter values. So enter length. We like to put the colon and the space so that we separate the length. And then the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to create our variables within the main that we can use to store the data that we want to enter into the class. So at the top here, I'm going to create a variable called num1. I'm going to create a variable called num2 that will represent the length and the width respectively. So we prompt the user to enter a length, and then we accept that length into num1 using the cin command. And we're going to do something similar for num2. So num2 in this case would represent our width. We're making the adjustments to the code we have copied and pasted. And we will have num2 storing the width. Now, you can use appropriate names. I'm just using num1 and num2 in this case because I want to show the distinction between num1 and L and num2 and W, because in fact they are different variables. So what we now do for the store details is that we now place num1 where we want the length to be represented, and we put num2 where we want the width to be represented. And we are now going to execute this and see what obtains. So it's now asking us to input a length. Let's say that the length is 18. And it's asking us for width. Let's say that the width is 22. And if we hit the enter key, then we see that the output is consistent with what was entered by the user. So the user entered 18 and 22. And we are seeing that displayed as the output is 18 and 22 for length and width. So we have essentially created an interactive program by getting the user input and passing it into the respective method so that the property of the class can be updated. It's now time for us to do something similar in terms of Python. So we are back over in the Python screen, and we want to now obtain in the main program the input from the user. Remember in Python, we create variables by simply typing them and associating the data values with them. So it's going to be equal to, and we put the input keyword, because the input keyword allows us to obtain the input. So in this case, it's enter with, length, we did first, colon, and a space. And that data value is now going to be accepted by the user, and it's going to be assigned to the num1 variable. We're going to copy and paste and do something similar for num2. Remember, num2 represents the width. So we have the width here. And we can now take these details and we can place them inside the vehicle initialization method. The other thing that we need to bear in mind now, however, is that the data that we get from the input is actually stored as a string. And if we are going to be able to do any mathematical manipulation of the length and width properties, then we need to ensure that they are represented as numeric values. So what we are going to do, and I'm being consistent with what we have been doing so far, is I'm going to convert the output of the input into a numeric equivalent. And there are two ways to do this. We can use the int operation right here around the input statement. That's one way of doing it. And we would have explored that option already. But just to give another flavor, and one that might perhaps be a bit more intuitive, is that we know now that num1 is being stored as a string value. So I'll put a comment here that indicates that. So num1 and num2 are string values, or better yet, they are string representations. The string representations of numbers. Just for the example, it means that 22 will be stored like that, and it means that 18 will be stored like that. What we want to do is to ensure that the 18 and the 22, which are in these representations, are going to be converted to 22 and 18 respectively, which are the numeric equivalent. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say num1 is assigned int num1. And I'm going to say that num2 is assigned int num2. So what I'm attempting to do here is to look at the value that is in num1 and convert it to an integer. And then we put that new value back into num1. In other words, we are overwriting the value that is inside of num1 and num2 respectively. We're now going to therefore take num1 that represents the length into the vehicle initialization module or method, and we're going to do the same thing for num2. And we can now execute this and try and see if we get the same thing as we got in the previous example. Now remember, we had used 18 and 22 for the data values. So we're going to do the same thing over here, where 18 is going to represent the length and 22 is going to represent the width. So let's execute. It asks us to enter the length. Let's enter 18. It asks us to enter the width. Let's enter 22. And once we do our output, then we realize that the length and the width are 18 and 22 respectively. To also be further consistent with what we did over in C++ in terms of the output, we had placed a new line before each of the operations or each of the outputs. So we are going to do the same thing here. So we're putting a new line before length. We're putting a new line before width. when we are displaying the information. So let's re-execute. So 18 for length, 22 for width. And we see we have some spaces here. Length is 18, width is 22. So the spaces here just separate the input from the output so that things are a bit more clear in terms of the visuals that we are seeing. I'm also noticing that it has placed an extra line here that we probably don't want. So I'm going to get rid of the new line from width. And then once we execute again, then we see that both outputs are compatible with each other. And what we have accomplished in this session is to make our main program more interactive by virtue of allowing the user to be able to enter the data values that they want to use to update the properties of the class.